Hello everyone, my name is Ross McGill. I'm a Deputy Head Teacher. On Twitter my name is Teacher Toolkit. I'm here with Sue Thompson, the Senior Publisher at GL Assessment, and we're talking about smart data in the classroom. It's a lovely sunny evening here in Chiswick in London. I hope it's not too bad where you are. The kind of things we're going to cover are data issues, how it could be possibly misused, could be pointless, how it might increase your workload. We've got several questions to go through. We're going to answer as many as we can in the 30 minutes that we have together. Just before we start, I'm just going to quote a little bit of research and some context for everybody that's listening. According to the government, 53% of teachers think data is the biggest contributing factor to increasing workload. And a recent survey of teachers by GL Assessment found that 95% of teachers think data has a place in the classroom. And the problem is clearly that too much data is bad and not enough of it is smart. To help me unpack what smart data is and how teachers can avoid the bad variety of data, I'd like to welcome Sue Thompson, Senior Publisher of GL Assessment. Sue, good evening.
Hello there.
Nice to meet with you and get chatting about data. Should we go straight into our first question?
I think so, yes, let's do that.
So what are the most important things you should look for in assessment?
I think it's really important that when a school is planning an assessment regime, they look at maybe a combination of assessments, things that give them a range of data. You clearly want to make sure that the individual assessments are addressing the assessment needs that you have. And once you've done that, I think you need to make sure, particularly if you're looking at reading or maths or English, that the assessment is fairly recent, that the data that attaches to it reflects current standards, because we know that standards change over time. Yeah. So that's why we tend to have a rolling programme of refreshing the data attaching to our tests on a regular basis. Clearly, again, if you're looking excuse me, at attainment, some sort of alignment with the curriculum that you're working alongside is also very, very useful. But I think what's really important as well is to look at what comes from that assessment and how much comes with that assessment that helps you understand the data. And we have been trying a great deal with our recent assessments to make that end of the process as easy and as straightforward for teachers by explaining what the data means, by adding interpretation, so that the teacher isn't just looking at a table of numbers and thinking, what do I do now? We're trying to add to that process and say, this is what this means for this group, for this cohort, for this individual student.
Yeah, I mean, I like your, the publications and the software that you've got, the whole people approach, your complete digital solution.
I think that's what I'm trying to say when I talk about planning and looking at complementing assessments and making sure that you're covering things that are going to work together, really. Clearly, an assessment needs to be valid and reliable, and those terms we use very specifically. So something is valid if it can be shown to test what it sets out to test, and the reliability is about, if you were to repeat that test, would that score be within a particular band so that we can say that it's a reliable score? And those things are really, really important, and those are the things that cause us to take 2 to 3 or even 4 years to produce a really good, robust assessment.
Okay, right, thank you for that. Let's move on. I'll avoid the word regime, but what would an assessment schedule that is time efficient and beneficial look like?
I've given this quite a lot of thought, really, and we have got our whole pupil view that you've referred to, and I think that covers off quite a lot of the main aspects of assessment that a school would benefit from. I think planning and communication with colleagues is absolutely key, and I've also thought that maybe planning over the more than 1 year, if you can do that, to try and look at where you would like to follow your students, for example, from when they come in at year 7. A lot of students do their CAT assessment there, and what are you going to do then to supplement CAT year on year to look at their attainment?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you a bit of context. We use CAT testing, and I have in many schools that I've worked in, and when you're in a large secondary school, 1,000 plus students, you could potentially have 50 different primary schools. lots of different data, lots of potentially different benchmarks and quality. So it's important that a school can get to grips with the students that they have, and CAT test is a very useful tool that I've used in our experience to get a handle on where the kids are at. And it certainly informs, gives teachers the right data that we can use straight away for the lesson planning, and that's something that we use almost week one.
Yes,
week 2.
And that is typical, and that we talk about time efficiency in terms of testing. So the ways of making sure that you use your assessment time well. Now, CAT takes 2 hours, maybe 2.25 hours to administer to the children, but for me, that's investing that time, because you will see those benefits not just in that first year, but in subsequent years. CAT is something where you may do it every 2 or every 3 years, but it's a reference point that you can keep using. So I think certainly we're seeing a big move to digital testing, because it does save time. It means that you're doing no marking, and it means that you get instant reports. And you can also combine data through our combination report, so you can look at CAT, and that gives you contextualized data for your English, your maths and your reading assessment. So anything like that where the teacher isn't having to deal with lots and lots of paper, they can run one report and it's all done for them.
So in terms of the solutions that you offer and the kind of things that you could do with your software, for example, what would be the main reason for choosing a standardised test?
A standardised test does something which other tests can't do. It reflects and enables you to benchmark the national picture for whatever you are assessing. So we work with hundreds of schools on any given project, and we test thousands and thousands of children. And the tests have been very, very carefully constructed to reflect, for example, the different genders. We analyse for gender bias and that sort of thing.
Insight into what's going on across the nation.
We do, absolutely. We can see exactly where children are achieving well and where there are challenges. And the challenge for us is to create an assessment that is as inclusive as possible. So it's going to allow children who have very high levels of skill or ability to demonstrate that, but at the same time to allow children who may have additional needs to actually access the test, and those outcomes will then give the teacher good diagnostic information to work with. So a standardised test is something very different to a national exam or a teacher test or anything else. Or there are lots and lots of termly testing that you can do that will give you some information, but nothing gives you that national profile, which is so important. And also what you're doing is you are producing in the standard age score a point of comparison with children of exactly the same age across the country.
And what kind of, going back to the classroom teacher, if they're doing the standardised test, what kind of information could you provide to help them put it into context without necessarily the teacher relying on the senior teacher to communicate or help them with that?
Well, that's where our reports really come into their own, because obviously we feature a lot of scores. We explain what the scores mean, but we do a lot of additional analysis. So, for example, in a reading test, you would have a score, but you would also have an analysis of the different aspects of reading comprehension that have been tested and how the child has fared in those different aspects of comprehension. So you could see immediately, for example, if retrieval is secure, but infant needs additional support. So things like that are just written in straightforward language. A lot around what to do next. So, for example, you've talked about CAT, using it in the school for target setting, for starting a dialogue with students. With the learning profile there, you've got information for the teacher, for the student and for the parent.
So what would be the main, so for example the CAT test, what would be the main pieces of information that a teacher could get from that test?
Well, you get 4 pieces of information. So this is where the concept of a standard age score really comes into its own, because not only can you assess a child against the national profile of students across the country of the same age. You can also compare across assessments because they've all been scaled on the same scale. So when you look at CAT, you can make a very direct comparison, and you can say a particular student has a verbal score of 100, they have a non-verbal score of 80, then we know that there's a significant positive difference in terms of their verbal skills. So by looking at that profile, that can give a lot of information to a teacher. But we go beyond that and we create a profile of learning preference in CAT and the implications for teaching and learning. So there's there's the visual, there's the statistical, but there's also the commentary that helps the teacher understand what has been tested and how that will have an impact on how they teach that child.
Okay, I'm going to give you a scenario. I'm a very busy teacher, so classroom teacher teaches 25 hours a week. I'm just going to quote Greg Watson, who's the Chief Executive of GL Assessment. Too much data is about control, not improvement. Too much of it is misused and far too much of it is pointless. So if I could put you on the spot, Sue, what would be your top tip for a busy teacher interpreting the data from a CAT test, for example?
If I was doing it for a group of students, I would go immediately to we have a section which shows the different profiles and it lists the children under the different profiles, and we give about 4 or 5 bullet points for each profile, and that would immediately say the characteristics of this set of students are these. And a lot of teachers say, actually, I recognise that in those particular students. If I was working with an individual, I would do exactly the same thing. We have indicators for things like GCSEs. I wouldn't look at those. I would look at the learning profile, and I would look at the recommendations for supporting that student, whether they need additional support because they have weak verbal skills, or whether they need extra challenge because they have a high even profile. So we've got lots and lots of different combinations.
So they're kind of bite-sized.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So you've got the visual there with the showing exactly where that student is in a visual way, but also then that narrative, which is quite punchy. It's all bullet pointed, and it's quite practical as well.
Okay, great. So let's move on. Again, to the audience, if you have any questions, put them in the chat box, and we'll do our best to answer them as we go through. So Sue, what's the one question you hear most frequently about standardised assessment data?
I would say, without a doubt, it's concern about changes in scores over time, particularly when tests are given year on year and results, in which I mean scores, are relayed to parents. So there is a confidence band around any score. So you could have a score of 100, which would be average in terms of the standard age scores. But around that, we have what we call a 90% confidence interval. And that means that 9 times out of 10, that score would be between, let's say, 95 and 105. So if there's a little bit of movement in scores year on year within those confidence bands, there's no significant difference in performance. And sometimes that is
misconceived.
It's misconceived, and I think I do think it comes in when actual scores are being given to parents, and I think sometimes teachers are worried that they won't be able to understand that, because it is quite a complicated concept.
No, it is. And if I think through the vast majority of my 20 years in teaching, I've always been scared of data, and it simply boils down to I've not understood it. Or, if I go back to when I was at NQT, I might not understand what tests I was doing or the reasons why.
Absolutely,
And through lots of professional development, experience, you start to learn the power of data and what meaning it can actually have in your own classroom.
That's something we haven't touched on, but I think bringing your colleagues on board is really, really important in this process. Understanding the programme of assessment, why it's being done, why particular assessments are being done, and then giving them that information. For example, if they are going to relay scores to parents, making sure they're confident in understanding how to explain some of these smaller anomalies. The other thing is where if a test is being used year on year, if there's a movement in scores, or if the same score is scored year on year, somehow that is perceived as the child not making progress. But because everything is age standardised, and you're doing the next level of difficulty where you're 9 or 10 months older, if you get the same score, that means you're performing at exactly the same level for your age. And that, again, that's something which is quite difficult to explain, but it's key, again, when you're feeding back to parents or to students.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go on to another question. How should you share results? So we go to your standardised assessments with pupils. How could we share those results so that it would help pupils?
I think most schools where I come into contact, they do share outcomes with students. I mean, certainly at secondary level, it comes into the planning.
Yeah, can you think of a really good example that you've seen in some schools of how it's shared really well?
I think probably CAT is the best example, although I'm sure it happens with others, other assessments. We have a student, I think it's the only assessment we have that has a student report, but because the idea of metacognition, you know, understanding why you're learning, how you learn, thinking through the process of learning is so important. I think something like the CAT student report, which is used quite widely, again, in a one-to-one setting as a part of the discussion, children then understand where their strengths and weaknesses lie, what they can do to maximise where they have strength and where they can maybe compensate and develop those other areas. So I think it is really, really really important that students are fed back, not necessarily around scores, but generally as part of a process that takes into account the fact that they've spent an hour, for example, doing an English or a maths test. They should get some feedback.
Well, there's a lovely quote from Russell Hobby, General Secretary of the NAHT. He said, "Assessment needs to be robust, but it also needs to be insightful. Too often we sacrifice one for the other. While it is good teaching that raises standards, good assessment helps to support better teaching and better learning." Yeah,
there was something that I was watching one of the videos that was shot at our National Assessment Conference that took place a couple of weeks ago, and there was a quote there that said assessment should generate questions, and I thought that was really, really a good way of putting it.
Well, I mean, you know, if I put it back to the classroom teacher, you know, I've marked my books, I've got an immediate differentiation tool in front of me, hand the books back to the students, I've assessed the work, I look at the latest CAT scores, I then can plan my lesson, plan my seating plan. If you understand it's a very powerful device.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, let's move on. So in terms of parents, what's your advice for sharing the data with parents?
Well, I think schools vary in this. Some schools don't go anywhere near a parent with standardised test scores.
Yeah.
But increasingly, I think schools do want to feedback to parents. And I think if you are spending time assessing children, then I think it's only fair that that is in the mix, especially if sometimes assessments can throw up, you know, unexpected results that perhaps do need to be addressed. So there could be an issue around a CAT profile that shows very high potential, but the child's attainment is actually below average, and what is the reason for that? And you would need then to bring those results in.
In my experience, you know, whatever you share with parents, the parents must understand it.
You're quite right, yes.
And it can be red, green, yellow, and whatever else, and it's got 1,000 numbers on it. But if your parents do not understand what the data is and how they can support the child at home, you're only kind of halfway there, really.
Well, we're doing more and more of that. I mean, we've just published our baseline progress, which is an end of reception assessment, and it goes with a beginning of the year assessment. And in baseline itself, we have a parent report, and that's all about homeschool links, With baseline progress, we haven't got as far as a parent report, but we've put together a lot of advice that sits on our website. Again, it's all about the teacher needing to understand what may be happening in the home environment that is affecting the pupil's performance, and also sharing with the parent, particularly with these very young children, what's happening in the classroom so that they are supporting the school in an appropriate way. So I think there's more of that to come, really. And it doesn't need to be around numbers. You know, if the school wants to do that, and I do know schools where they send out the pupil, the parent report with the whole array of scores with just a sort of crib sheet, and that seems to work. Others, you know, the phone is red hot the next day. What does this mean?
Well, we'll pick up on maybe some bad examples. I might quote a bit of the workload challenge, the DFE reports that have recently come out, particularly the data report. We've got a few more questions that we're going to ask. We're going to start with time and workloads. How much time do you think teachers need to interpret the data? We go back to the beginning quote at the start of the session, where we kind of quoted that 53% of teachers think data is the biggest contributing factor to increasing workload. Sue, how much time do you think teachers should spend on data?
I mean, that is a tricky one. Clearly, there's a conflict there. Is that there isn't enough time, but they recognise the value of data. We do have a very nice example from one of our schools. It is St Bede's, a case study we have of St Bede's, where they actually use inset days to both prepare for the assessments to come, but also to make sure that staff understand what they will be receiving in those assessment reports. So I think that's a really nice way of approaching it. If you can
and some of them,
give over some of that time.
Even some staff development in my own school, I know we set quite a lot of time aside for staff to learn how to use new pieces of software.
Absolutely,
working collaboratively in different departments to compare data, identifying one or two kind of champions to kind of showcase what their knowledge of the software is, but also how to interpret the data. And then, again, showcasing how that data then is used in the classroom. Yes,
and here what they do is they just make sure that the member of staff has the report that applies to them, so that you're not overwhelming somebody with too much data. So, you know, what the subject they're teaching or the children they're teaching, they only get to see that data in detail. Then I think it is a case of reading the report and maybe drilling down and taking from that report, as we said, any outstanding questions. Are there further assessment needs? How are you going to then work with those children who have different profiles, who have different levels of performance? But I think the reports that we produce, I won't say that it makes it easy, but it makes it more accessible to do that, because we do have that mix of the important statistics, but also the explanation to back that up. But it's quite punchy. You know, it's not going on for pages and pages, and it's not trying to tell the teacher what to do. It's saying, here are some results. You might like to think about these things as they apply to this group or this individual.
And I've got in front of me the page 13 of the data review group workload report that's just been published over Easter. And there's 2 bullet points for teachers. The first bullet point saying record data accurately and ensure it is correct first time. And the second one, if you do not understand why data is being collected, ask. Moving on, I'm just going to quote Daisy Christodoulou, who's quoted in one of your publications. She is the Research and Development Manager for Art Schools. And Daisy said, accurate measurement can sometimes seem quite pedantic and nitpicking, but we know from other walks of life that accurate data can be transformative. So in terms of unnecessary assessment, Sue, what's your opinion on start of the year, end of the year, 3 times, 6 times a year? What's your experience? Tell us.
I think over-assessment is a real danger, and that can then have negative consequences. Our assessments are very carefully structured. Some of them can be used twice a year. Some of them can be used at the beginning and the end of the year.
From your software, from HQ, in terms of looking at the software, can you see how often it is used by schools?
We can do that. It's not something we do. We tend to find out what's happening when we get into one-to-one discussions, and we do lots and lots of events, and we do lots of teacher panels, and sometimes you do hear things which you feel are not going to benefit the school or the pupil or the teacher because they're just doing too much of it. So we have a clear vision of what you would do, when you might do it. I think there needs to be some flexibility because you're always going to need to do some reassessment of certain children, and we do have assessments that can do that. Mm-hmm. You are also going to have to identify some students for whom your first level screening is not enough. Yeah. You're going to have to do something that's more diagnostic. Mm-hmm. You may well have children who are on an intervention program, mm-hmm. and a standardized assessment is absolutely ideal for beginning and end to show the progress that they've made. So I think there has to be quite a bit of flexibility in any program of assessment. Mm-hmm. But we're saying, 3 or 4 times a year, put an assessment in place. That's going to give you a lot of rich data that can inform either going forward, or it's going to show you how the child has made progress. It's going to come up maybe at the end of the year. CAT every 2 to 3 years, and keep referring to CAT. That's what I'd like to see schools doing, to make sure that they understand the context of that child's ability profile and their potential. So I think don't do too much. I know that sounds a bit daft, but don't do too much for the majority.
Again, going back to the workload report, and obviously this is for English schools, but I think it applies for anywhere really. I'm just going to pick up some highlights. Do not routinely collect formative assessment data unless there's obvious issues of performance or underachievement. And do not collect data outside of agreed data collection points. So, schools might publish an assessment calendar, and again, this would help teacher workload. And I think when parents know where dates are published, when they can expect a report, then I guess teachers know when they need to be using assessment and the tools that are there to support.
Well, I like that idea of an assessment calendar. I think that's really good, and then everybody knows where they are. I would say, though, about collecting formative assessment, I think if you do that through a standardised test or assessment, and you do that early in the year, that then can underpin your planning. And it can be a reference point, and if you then want to repeat that assessment towards the end of the year, you will be able to measure progress. Okay. So I think there is an argument for collecting that formative assessment early in the school year, or early in some sort of process, and then you've got some clear information that will supplement your own experience of those pupils, your own judgments about those pupils, that can inform what you do with those pupils in the next period of teaching.
We're going to ask you one last cheeky question. You and I were both children once, school at different times. What do you think a child would most like in terms of data? So what, for a child to understand the data, what do you think children would most like to see from a report, from a teacher? What do you think the child would want to get from the information? So that they've got the report from their parents, they've taken it home from school.
That's really tricky. I'm thinking about my school reports, which I found recently because I moved out.
Were they clear for you to understand?
No, because it was all this C+ and could do better. And, one little scribbled line of,
So I think that's my point. I think as teachers in schools, we all have to remember that it's the child's report and it's their data, and it might help us to better lesson plan and better assess, and it might predict patterns. But ultimately, it's about the children, and the child needs to understand what they need to do to improve.
I think it's more to do with the description of how they've done, and not a short line. Or I know that's adding to workload. I know. I think avoiding this sort of arbitrary sort of grading system that certainly was in place when I was at school, and I think also seeing a commitment that profile is going to be used, or that set of data is going to be used to support the child. I think that's really important. And I think through what we're doing, what schools are doing, we know they're doing, they're sharing it with the children, they're talking to the children about how they've done, what they need to do, where they've done really, really well. And I think we just need to try and do more of that, really.
Yeah. Okay, and that's a good way to finish. So I'd like to just thank everyone for listening. My name is Ross McGill, Teacher Toolkit on Twitter. I'm at GL Assessment with Sue Robinson. Thanks for listening, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.